Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust. Well, I'm away this week, so I just wanted to do a short one that's been on my agenda for quite a while. And it turns out that this is rather fortuitous timing because we're coming up just on the 5-year anniversary of one of the worst acts of cultural vandalism ever to strike the small screen. And what would that be?
Anhan Reheshisan Dati.
Yep, it's going to be the 5th anniversary of that atrocity of a Game of Thrones finale next month in May.
A date which will live in infamy.
However, one thing that I did not realize until I began my studies is how much this series, Game of Thrones, borrowed from British history, particularly Roman and early medieval, which of course is my area of study. Let's start with the obvious, the maps. Here's Westeros and here's Britain. Is it not obvious enough for you? Let's try flipping Westeros around. See it now? And that's just the very obvious. Let's delve into the history a bit. So you had the original people of Westeros, the First Men, and they actually weren't really the first because they took over from the Children of the Forest. Now those First Men were displaced by the Andals and the Rhoynar from across the sea. And then finally, here comes Aegon the Conqueror. Well, this looks like a little bit of a mashup of what we call the Celtic population of Britain. Now, when you say Celtic today, I suppose because of its association with paganism and druids, that evokes for people a lot of this green, trees, children of the forest kind of imagery. So the Romans come after that. And they push the children of the forest, I mean the Celts, all the way into the northern, western extremes of the island, so Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, and they impose their own culture in what's called the Southlands or Lowland Britain. And then they establish King's Landing, I mean London, and to protect their fledgling civilization on the island, they
build that wall, build that wall, build that wall.
And that would be Hadrian's Wall right over there, built at a narrow place between what is today England and Scotland. And after a few generations, as the empire pushed north, they built the Antonine Wall at an even narrower point. And as they were doing this, they were pushing what they saw as these savage people back. And they were known by different names, the Caledoni, the Picti, etc. And doesn't that sound a lot like Game of Thrones? And check out that date, 297. Literally in our own calendar system, that is when Roman Britain was in full swing. And as that border became more permanent, the people beyond the wall really began to be seen as a bunch of savages, exotic people who tattooed and painted their bodies. Kind of like the wildlings in Game of Thrones, right?
Load of bones.
And just like the Wall in Game of Thrones and their Night Watch, Hadrian's Wall was also constantly garrisoned by legionnaires who operated out of various forts, like if you remember Vindolanda from our wooden dildo episode. And just like the Night's Watch, as the empire declined, they began to have trouble fully garrisoning these forts. And if you remember when Jon Snow first joined them, they were a pretty thin bunch. And though the Wall in Game of Thrones is pretty sick, Hadrian's Wall, yeah, not so much. And the Antonine Wall, even less impressive. But still, the parallels are undeniable. Well, so Roman Britain is chugging along, the empire's declining, and then along came two groups of people to upset the apple cart. The Angles, and don't they sound a lot like the Andals from Game of Thrones? And the Saxons, Now, there were, of course, the Jutes, but everyone forgets about them anyway. And so these two Germanic tribes came across the water, the Angles, who went to northern and central England, and the Saxons, who went more to the south. And incidentally, in Game of Thrones, we have the Rhoynar, one of two of the invading groups of people, the other being the Andals. And the Rhoynar went more to the south of Westeros, to a peninsula called the Sunspear, and there they became known as the Dornish. And doesn't this seem quite suspiciously similar to the peninsula in Britain called Cornwall, where we have the Cornish? And they remained a semi-autonomous people well into the late medieval age. And how about those people across the water in Essos? They were notorious slavers, right? Well, it turns out that's exactly what was going on at this time in Ireland over here, where their main trade was in slaves, and a lot of those slaves were taken from Britain, from England. In fact, have you ever heard of St. Patrick? Well, he was not Irish. He was actually a Brit who was kidnapped as a boy, brought as a slave to Ireland, where he escaped in a especially harrowing and suspicious tale. But in any event, he made it back to England, became a bishop, and then went back to Ireland to convert the natives as the second bishop of Ireland. And you know who else were pretty notorious slavers and raiders? The Vikings. And of course, the Vikings would eventually come to conquer Ireland and half of England. But long before that, they had established footholds in the far north, in a chain of islands called the Orkneys and the Shetlands also. Now, if you look at that on the map, doesn't that look suspiciously like the Iron Islands of Game of Thrones, which aren't quite that far north, but very similar geographically? And who inhabited the Iron Islands but a bunch of raiders and slavers who were known for their brutality? Okay, well, by the time those Vikings really showed up in force in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had formed 7 kingdoms called the Heptarchy. And obviously, hello, Game of Thrones.
I was born to rule the 7 kingdoms.
And those 7 kingdoms eventually merged into one country, which became known as England, that was very prosperous and relatively peaceful. But now here comes the part that is probably most similar to Game of Thrones. The ending sucked, because along comes William the Conqueror, and he pretty much kills and enslaves everyone and displaces the existing order, and commits a little bit of cultural genocide along the way. And that sounds remarkably like Aegon the Conqueror. And Aegon's son Maegor built the Red Keep to safeguard his power in King's Landing, just like William the Conqueror built the Tower of London, which you can still visit today, and when you go there you'll see it's much more of a fortress than just a tower. So yeah, you can see between the histories and geographies of these two stories, really the broad arcs are very much in parallel. However, there are even more specific and subtle similarities. For example, everyone remembers the Battle of the Blackwater, right? Well, it turns out there's a Blackwater in England too, and that was where in 991 the Battle of Maldon was fought. And in this battle, a local nobleman called Berthnoth put up a heroic but ultimately foolhardy defense against the Vikings, and a statue commemorating his heroism still to this day stands in the town of Maldon. And how about religions? Well, the Celts were pagans, and then the Romans took over and they were also pagans, and then they became Christians, and then the Anglo-Saxons took over and they were pagans, at least in the early part. Just like the Rhoynar and the Andals were also pagans with their 7 gods. But then along came Christianity, which is kind of like Melisandre's Lord of Light religion, which was also monotheistic. And just like the state religion of Westeros, the Christian church in England in the medieval times became incredibly corrupt. A lot of the bishops and monks and nuns and abbesses were really just relatives of the royalty, but they were younger siblings. So they couldn't inherit their titles and they had nothing better to do, so they parked them in monasteries and in the church. And a lot of them lived very decadent lives. If you read the accounts of how much alcohol they drank, it was absolutely insane. We're talking gallons a day. And a lot of them, according to accounts of the time, couldn't even recite basic Bible verses and things like the Ten Commandments. And pretty soon, the church, because it was constantly given land by the royalty and nobles called Bookland, became the largest landowner in the country. So starting in the 940s, there was a big monastic reform movement that rose in England and began to become more and more popular. And what it was trying to do was curb the church of its excesses. And one of the early leaders in that was a pretty badass guy named Bishop Dunstan. And he rose eventually to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, kind of like the High Septon in Westeros. And just like another reformist, or we could say fanatic head of the church, the Sparrow, Dunstan was not afraid to challenge the monarchy.
Rich or poor, noble or common, if we sin, we must atone.
In fact, there's one well-attested story which comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the main source of historical information of this time. And in this story, Dunstan notices the young king Eadwig go missing from a banquet in which there are a lot of nobles present, so this is an important banquet. And where did the king go? Well, according to the Chronicle, he went to caress these whores. And who would these whores be? Well, according to one version of the Chronicle, that was Athel Gifu and her daughter, Aelgifu, who would later go on to be Eadwig's wife. Ugh. So just like Game of Thrones, there's a lot of weird sex stuff in this story and even a little bit of incest for good measure.
Jaime and I are more than brother and sister. We shared a womb. Came into this world together, we belong together.
And what did Dunstan do? Well, he went and found the king and the mother-daughter pair in bed. And this is now a direct quote that I have to read. He found them as though they were wallowing in some revolting pigsty and fornicating with the harlots. And what did he do? He dragged the king out of bed and humiliated him in front of the whole assembled group of nobles. And I'm guessing they were wearing a lot fewer clothes than this picture is depicting. So yeah, Dunstan was a pretty righteous dude. He definitely had some balls to challenge the monarchy like that. And he actually lived a long time for that age. Probably something like 80 years, and he had multiple rises and falls, so he was around quite a long time. Ah yes, and then of course there's Beric Dondarrion, a fallen noble who turns outlaw and leads his band of righteous men in attacking the tyrannical powers that be. And they do this by hiding out in Hollow Hill in the middle of the forest, and he's supported in this effort by Thoros of Myr, a fat, dissolute drunkard who turns holy man and sort of becomes the proselytizer for the cause.
Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? What does the Lord see in me?
For the night is dark and full of terrors.
Sound a bit like another supposed nobleman, Robin Hood, hiding out in Sherwood Forest with his band of merry men, and supported by another fat drunkard and man of the cloth, Friar Tuck.
Oh!
Hell, George R.R. Martin even explicitly said that he based the notorious Red Wedding on a particularly gruesome bit of intrigue from Scotland in the late medieval times. But that's a few hundred years after the period we've been discussing. And anyway, we can keep playing this game all night long, so I'm just going to cut it off there. So no, Game of Thrones is not a facsimile of this period of British history, but there are a lot of parallels. Some obvious, some rather subtle. So you can see it's a lot more than just the big ones that people talk about, like the Seven Kingdoms and the Wall.
That's all I have to say about that.